Looks like all the people in internet land. Maybe that's why nobody's here tonight. Everybody,
They're all
I should just
online.
do away with all of this. Maybe that's the way to do it. Do away with all this online stuff and force people to show up.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about the use of parables and how Allah uses parables in the Quran. Um, and so picking up on the 26th verse, where Allah says, "Inna Allah la yastahi ayadriba mathalan ma bawda'atan fama fawqah." Right. So it's Allah says He's not ashamed to make an example even of like a little tiny thing like a gnat or even something smaller than that. And it might seem like from the preceding verse, like, oh, suddenly it sort of jumps track or it changes, it changes topic. Um, and it's important to remember that, the Quran wasn't revealed all at once. Right? It comes down in parts, and that it often was dealing with particular situations on the ground. So when it changes its voice, right, that's an indication, something else is going on. So the background behind this verse, and we'll go into a little bit, right, is that um, as the Prophet ﷺ began, or as he continued in his mission, preaching and whatnot, naturally, both the, I guess you could say, like the elite or the higher ups of the pagans of Quraysh, and then also the Jews, because there wasn't really a Christian community. There were a few individual Christians, but there was an established Jewish community in Yathrib. So they got word of that there was somebody claiming to be a prophet. And one thing that the Jews of Medina, or at least that area, one thing they kind of objected to when they heard these parables, they said, well, why would Allah, if Allah is so majestic and high, right? Why would Allah, for instance, make a parable about a spider's web and how an argument is as frail, right, as a spider's web, being that a spider is like a little tiny thing. So from their point of view, they felt that this was not befitting of the majesty of God, right? And therefore, they're like, nah, this can't be revelation because, from their point of view, we know revelation, right? The other part is that they were, having been a people who had had prophets sent to them, over a long period of time, they kind of felt like, well, we know God. We know God, and we know what God sounds like, and we know what God doesn't sound like. And therefore, it's not really resonating with us, right? So Al-Wahidi says in his Asbab al-Nuzul, or the conditions around revelation, he relates, he said, ما يشبه هذا كلام الله فأنزل الله هذه الآية. Right? They said, this doesn't resemble, right, what we knew to be revelation. So part of the lesson from this is, you know, God doesn't act according to our dictates. Allah doesn't act according to our dictates. Alaikum salam. Nor does Allah necessarily have to express Himself in a language that will always be what we will expect it to be, right? And especially that here comes a new revelation. Uh, they were kind of thinking, well, it's going to be in the old key. It's going to be the same old tune. We know these old tunes, right? And suddenly it's in a new key, so to speak. And they just didn't recognize it for what it was. And this is something important for us to consider when trying to, what we call give da'wah, or trying to teach or call people to Islam, is to realize that some people's initial, right, because this is not at the end of Revelation, this is getting more towards the middle part, right? Some people in their initial reaction to Islam, they go, I don't recognize that, right? Um, and therefore we have to, in the same way that the Prophet ﷺ was encouraged not to be discouraged by this, we also have to not be discouraged by people not being familiar with it. And also, undoubtedly, at some point, Islam is going to bring something that everybody is going to be made to feel a little bit uncomfortable with, in that it's not, even though it is musaddiqan bayna yadayhi, right? It is that confirmation. It's also bringing something new, right? So even if it was just as simple as uh, some of the rabbinical laws, right? The Jews, their food laws are way more complicated than ours, right? We share some similarities. You know, we don't, they don't eat pork, we don't eat pork, right? But they have way more complicated food laws. So, in the same vein, right? Where, say, coming from a pagan or nominally Christian background, the idea, and I've even seen, you know, people react to Jews this way. The idea that the guy would tell you what to eat and not to eat, for some people is like a total foreign concept, right? You know, God isn't a waiter or a chef that's like, you know, taking your order. Oh, sorry, 69 that we're out of this or whatever, you know. Um, so that just that expectation of what it ought to be, that is what initially threw a lot of people off. And yet, that's also precisely what it was. So in that Allah says that Allah is not too shy, istihya, Allah is not too shy to use a parable about something as small as a little tiny insect or even smaller, right? Uh, is there to show us that um, this thing it's going to speak in a language that's going to challenge us, right? And in fact, that's one of the things that Ash-Shawkani in his tafsir, he says, أنزل الله هذه الآية ردا على الكفار لما أنكروا ما ضربه سبحانه من الأمثال. So Ash-Shawkani says in his tafsir, he says Allah sent down these verses as a refutation, right, against, and I want to clarify the word, you know, kufar a little bit. Not just somebody that doesn't, like kafir is a little bit different than kufar, right? Kufar is like what I would say like the ardent opponents of Islam, right? So like the average person living in Mecca or Medina may not have been a Muslim, but they may not have been like totally committed against Islam, right? But there were certain people that definitely were, right? So he's saying that Allah had sent this down because they kind of had a dog in a fight against Islam. So he said that Allah revealed this as a refutation against those ardent opponents of Islam, and that they denied, he uses the word lamma ankaru ma daraba, right? He said that when they denied what Allah was making analogy to. And the interesting thing, he uses the word in Arabic, ankara. Ankara can, on one hand, mean to deny something, but it can also mean to reject something that you're not familiar with or that you can't identify with. So your rejection of a thing is actually not 100% based upon the facts, but it's just like, well, I don't know this. You know, this is different. I'm just rejecting it because it's different, right? So it's an important aspect of what this verse here is dealing with. And then after this, Allah goes on to talk about, right, you know, then it's kind of like, that's why they're asking, well, what does, ماذا أراد الله بهذه مثلا? What does Allah mean by this example, right? Talking about a gnat or an insect or, you know, spider's web, right? And then that's why you'll notice actually in your mushaf, right, in your copy of the Qur'an on this ayah, you'll see between the words mathalan and yudillu bihi, you'll see like a little meme, right? And this is for a mandatory stop, right? Because Allah then continues by saying, what yudillu bihi kathiran wa yahdi bihi kathiran, right? That Many people, because of this, right, are misguided, and also, some people are guided. Meaning, part of it is going to be, how do you come to this? How are you coming to the? Are you going to come to the Quran with an open mind, right? Not even necessarily 100% convinced, but if you're not even going to have an open mind about it, then يُضِلُّ بِهِ كَثِيرًا, right? A lot of people will be misguided because of this, because in a sense, they're expecting revelation to be just like what they knew before. It's in some way saying, well, we know what God is already going to say. He's already said these things before, so we already know what he's going to say, right? This is a statement, of ignorance and of arrogance. And then Allah says, what? وَمَا يُضِلُّ بِهِ إِلَّا الْفَاسِقِينَ, right? And that, really it's only going to be really kind of deviant people that are going to be misguided by this, right? As well as الَّذِينَ يَنْقُضُونَ عَهْدَ اللَّهِ مِنْ بَعْدِ مِيثَاقِهِ, as well as those people who what? They break their contract with Allah after it's been agreed upon what to do. And some of this is, in a sense, specifically talking about some of the Jews of Medina, because there's certain verses in the Quran where Allah talks about Bani Israel, and He always talks about, often with them, their ahad, right? That they essentially had like a contract with Allah, right? And therefore, due to their breaking of their contract with Allah, this is وَيُفْسِدُونَ فِي الْأَرْضِ, like these are also the people that are going to go about, right, causing mischief on the earth, and أُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْخَاسِرُونَ, they will be the losers. So as we've said before, like, so how can we, for us, right, who are not from Bani Israel, what is the message to be taken from this personally? So even in our practice as Muslims, people who testify and believe and practice Islam, right, is to understand that Allah is not always going to operate in a way that will always conform with our expectations, right? Surah Al-Kahf is a very good example, right, of Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khidr, right? Musa goes on this journey with Al-Khidr and is completely like a fish out of water, right? Actually, he forgot his fish, right? But he's literally like a fish out of water, right? And Al-Khidr is doing all of these quote unquote crazy things, right? Not from his own, machinations, but because what? Allah says what? This is an abd that we gave our knowledge, min ladunna, right? That we gave him some of our knowledge. And Musa, who is used to, right? I mean, this is a prophet of God, a messenger of Allah, received revelation, has expectations of what it's going to be. And in his encounter with Al-Khidr, it completely does not meet these expectations whatsoever. So it's a good reminder for us in our lives, right, that we have to remember to kind of be a little bit flexible, stay on our toes, so to speak, and not always expect Allah to add up to our expectations, right? There's the passage in Surah Al-Fajr where Allah says, فَأَمَّا الْإِنسَانَ إِذَا مَا ابْتَلَاهُ رَبُّهُ فَأَكْرَمَهُ وَنَعَمَهُ, right? And then in the next verse, right, فَأَمَّا إِذَا مَا ابْتَلَاهُ فَقَدَرَ عَلَيْهِ رِزْقًا, right? These two verses in Surah Al-Fajr, the 89th chapter, Allah talks about, in one hand, right, He honors mankind by blessing him and gifting him and honoring him, but then others He constrains, right? The same verb, or, is what? Ibtila, is, bala, right? To cause strain or put to the test. On one hand, it's with a gift and a boon, and the other hand, it's with some trial and hardship. But Allah uses the same verb, the same description, ibtila, meaning that, getting out of this mindset of that, oh, if things are going good for me, this is a sign that, Allah is happy with me. And if things are hard, this is a sign that Allah is displeased with me, right? Because maybe this is just what meets your cultural expectations or your cultural understanding of who God is, right? Especially in this cultural context where people grow up with everything like, movies and Santa Claus and all this other stuff where they expect God, right, to act this way. So it's a good reminder for us that that isn't always the way that it's going to, right? And then part of the continued refutation of this, right, of why are you having an issue with me making parables, talking about insects and whatnot? كيف تكفرون بالله وكنتم أمواتا, right? How are you going to disbelieve in God, right, when you at one point weren't even alive, when you were dead, فأحياكم, right, and He caused you to be alive. So the very fact that you're here, right, if you want to question anything, don't question my parables that I'm making about, you know, gnats or, spiders' webs, right? If you really want to question anything, how are you even here? How did you get here, right? And if you want to do the chicken and egg, okay, well, you got here from your mom and dad. Well, where'd your mom and dad come from? And so on, right? كيف تكفرون بالله وكنتم أمواتم فأحياكم, right? How can you support disbelief in God when at one point you didn't exist, you were dead and you were brought to life, right? ثم يميتكم ثم يحييكم, right? Then we will cause you to die, live again, ثم إلينا ترجعون, right? And that you will return back to us. And then هو الذي خلق لكم ما في الأرض جميعا. This part here, I thought is really interesting, right? This, He's the one who has created everything in the heavens and the earth for you, right? This concept is something that I was reading a lot this week, been studying sustainability, which is a whole another issue. But the modern Western world has, through technology and whatnot, has led to great environmental degradation, right? And part of this came about from, from the sort of Western Euro Christian tradition, was the idea that, well, everything here was made for us, so we can do what we want to with it, versus just, everything was made for us, period, versus everything was made for us, comma, ... right? It is interesting that, هو الذي خلق لكم ما في الأرض جميعا. Everything in the earth was made for you, right? But it still belongs to Allah, right? And that we know kulu wa washrabu, eat and drink, but don't go to excess. So it's interesting that this idea of the earth being made for us is a truth. It's confirmed right here by Revelation. And yet that doesn't necessarily, in the verse, it doesn't give any carte blanche to just do whatever you want, like just a free, blank check, do whatever you want to with the earth. No, this is something different, right? And in fact, Allah just continues with what, ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى إِلَى السَّمَاءِ فَسَوَّاهُنَّ سَبْعَ سَمَوَاتٍ, right? And that, after He created everything for you in the earth, right? He then, right, arranged it into 7 heavens, right? That He, istawa, which for whatever, I don't know why, for some people this is a controversial verb, right? That He ascended, right, or mounted, right, and then to the sky, and then what? فَسَوَّاهُنَّ سَبْعَ سَمَوَاتٍ. And He arranged it in 7 layers, and that هُوَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٌ, and Allah has knowledge of all things. So then after this, it somewhat changes gears again, and now we get to not simply the creation story of man, but what I almost like to think of as the psychological creation story of man, where Allah says, وَإِذْ قَالَ رَبُّكَ لِلْمَلَائِكَةِ إِنِّي جَاعِلٌ فِي الْأَرْضِ خَلِيفَةً. And Allah says, and when your Lord said to the angels, I'm making a successor in the earth, قَالُوا أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يَفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيُفْسِكُ الدِّمَاءَ. Are you sure this is a great idea? Are you going to make somebody, right, that's going to cause a lot of chaos, right, and that's going to literally shed blood, right? وَنَحْنُ نُسَبِّحُ بِحَمْدِكَ وَنُصَدِّقُ, right? And all we do is just sing your praises and so on, right? Human nature, right? What is human nature? What is the template of human nature? It seems to be very complicated. On one hand, Islam does not advocate a original sin story in the way, at least from some, or probably say Orthodox Christian reading, right? Is that there's this fall of Adam, and whereas certainly on one hand, we believe in the fitrah, or the natural state, that we're born without sin. Matter of fact, we're not only born without sin, we're born without obligation, right? Obligation doesn't come upon you until you mature, right, to a certain age. So, children, when they're young, if they don't pray, they don't have to pray, right? Because they don't have taklif, they're not mukallaf, they don't have any obligation or responsibility. So on one hand, it's true, we do have the kind of clean slate idea. But then mixed in with the clean slate, no original sin, is, well, he might be sinless, but he or she does have some certain inclinations, and one of them seems to be towards violence. This is something that the angels were able to see in this successor that was going to be put into the earth, that the successor would be violent. And again, there's a lot of cultural assumptions about what is the perfect state, or for me, I saw this as really having a much more balanced and honest assessment, but maybe a bit more complicated, of what it is to be human. To be human is to come into the world with a clean slate. It is to be born sinless. But it is also to have some pre-programming, right? And one of those, blueprint, pre-installed, like you get your phone, it's got all this bloatware, it's got all these apps on it. One of those is the one that's predicated towards, shedding blood and causing chaos. And Allah doesn't actually refute this assessment of the angels. قال إني أعلم ما لا تعلمون. Allah just simply says, I know what you don't know, right? It doesn't say you're not wrong, which in itself is a tacit confirmation. It's like a passive confirmation of the angel's assessment. We are chaotic and violent. And what's interesting is that if you look throughout at least recorded human history, no civilization, including Muslim civilization, has ever been able to remove this component from the human being. Now, I'm not saying that we don't work to overcome our base nature, right? But I've noticed something in some spiritual traditions amongst Muslims and non-Muslims, is this idea of, in order to be an enlightened or worthy human being, is to be completely nonviolent. One, I don't see this as a possibility. And there's been some pretty enlightened civilizations throughout human history, right? None of them, including Muslim civilization, has been successful in removing this aspect. Meaning it's in there. You can't uninstall it. It's just like one of those apps, it can't be uninstalled. You can't jailbreak it. And this should then give us maybe, some feedback or a hint about where should we direct our creative energies into our spiritual endeavors. Now, yes, the Prophet ﷺ did say, la taghdab, don't get angry. And yet also at times, according to various narrations of other companions, the Prophet became angry. So was he being untruthful? This would be a blasphemous statement, right? So again, it paints a more complicated picture of what human so-called spirituality should be about. Yes, we should learn to control. So the whole point is that sometimes you'll hear people say, "Oh, you have to kill your nafs." I've heard people say this, right? Or you have to destroy your nafs. I don't even know if you can do that. No, I'm very serious. I've seen even in books about Islamic spirituality, right? You have to kill your nafs. You have to destroy your. I mean, well, number one, the nafs, right? Nafasa means to breathe. So if you destroy your nafs, you're dead, right? I mean, like sometimes how we articulate things is actually really, really important. So there's no way to get rid of it, right? And killing it would really be suicide, right? More of, if you look at how Allah describes what to do with that aspect of ourselves, وَمَنْ, قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. The one that's successful is the one who purifies it. Actually, it's quite the opposite of killing it, right? Is purify, right? And by purify, we don't mean like sterilize, like pour bleach on it, right? Matter of fact, we've seen the negative effects. I mean, to make kind of a loose parable, right? One of the issues we have now with a lot of young kids is their gut flora, right, is all messed up because we live, particularly in the developed world, we live in a hyper-sterilized society. They say actually the problem that kids have today, while their immune systems are so depressed, is that they're not playing in the dirt enough, right? As you're a kid, you play in the dirt, you actually get, there's some beneficial bacteria. There's some other stuff in there too, but there's some beneficial bacteria in there. And the idea that if you seek to sterilize your world, you will actually do yourself harm. There is no sterilizing the world for us as Muslims either, right? Allah is number one, He's created the world. He's done it in the way that He's chose to do it, and there is no sterilizing it. Another clue is that what? Allah sends prophets to who? People that generally don't believe. Otherwise, it'd be like a, preaching to the choir kind of thing, right? So prophets are often sent to people that what? Don't believe, stubborn, don't get it, don't want to get it, so on and so forth. Therefore, Allah is not sending His anbiya, His prophets and messengers to sterilized theological environments. He's sending them to where it's all mucky, right? So in the same way that we can see just in this one way, having a hyper-sterilized world isn't good. In the same way, it has some relation, or hopefully you can see, where I'm going with it. And I think that we need to, have a more practical articulation of what Islamic spiritual, even this word spirituality, I think is somewhat problematic. But if we're going to use it, then it needs to be truthfully based upon how Allah is articulating these things, right? So قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا. The one that is successful is the one that purifies the soul. وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَاهَا. Right? And the one that is the one who fails is essentially the one who either ignores it, causes it to go, defiles it in some way, right? So the soul is never talked in the Qur'an about destroying. It's always, وَمَنْ نَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ. The one that maybe denies, right, something that you want, like, I don't know, sex, wealth, power, greed, whatever, right? Allah uses the word often what? Naha, right? Nahi, right? To deny, right? Denying the soul or denying the nafs of something is very, very different than killing it, right? Or some of these other, somewhat ludicrous descriptions. Because one, you're setting off to do something either you can't do or will be very harmful for you, right? I think this comes again just from a general lack of reading the Qur'an closely, taking it personally, and seeing how does Allah describe these things in a language that is easily grasped, right? even though he doesn't tell you how to purify it, we all generally understand the mental picture of purification, right? I mean, you can imagine what a glass of water, that if it has something that's in, what do you do with it? You run it through something that filters out to purify it, right? I mean, that's something that is easily kind of grasped. So I think that's a much more helpful and beneficial way of looking at it. So that you know, we're created in this way. It also gives us, under no certain terms, right? We're not perfect. So it doesn't matter who we are, what our lineage is, we're going to have these issues of being mischievous, chaotic, and violent. And that tells us, you know, something right away. This is what I need to be aware of, that I have the capacity for, right? I have the capacity, even if I've never been violent in my life, I have the capacity for this. So it's almost like, you know, like my neighbor had a pit bull. I never liked that dog. And she was like, oh, you know, she was like, oh, Popeye's a really nice dog. Like, I don't care. That dog's crazy, right? It's just, I keep my eye on that dog. Whenever that dog was around, I was never relaxed. Even though I never saw that dog do anything. But just, to me, that was an unpredictable, I know somebody in internet land is going to be like, oh, pit bulls are what? That's an unpredictable breed, right? In the same way, we are also a somewhat unpredictable breed, right? We have things in our soul, right? Or when we see something, you know, that we crave or want, right? It automatically tells us, hey, I don't care where you get in your station in life, these are things you always need to be aware of, right? And if we were more preoccupied with that than being preoccupied with other people or amassing wealth or whatnot, the world probably would be a much nicer place to live in, right? So when we think about the civilizational power of Islam, it isn't about building domes or halal food everywhere, like halal food McDonald's. You know, it's more of these other softer, more subtle undercurrent things of, imagine a society, not perfect, but of which people, at least just as a, somewhere in the back of all of our minds, meaning some people to a lesser or greater extent, need to really work on myself and be concerned with myself and not so concerned with other things. One of the authors I was reading this week, he was talking about sustainability, and he was talking about how, you know, GDP is this number, right? You know, or what is it, domestic gross product, or whatever it is, you know. And it's this measure of where they look around the world and say, well, you know, which countries are successful? This country, you know, makes this, you know, produces this much, and what was interesting, that you have some countries that their GDP was really low compared to Western developed countries. And yet, when they did these census studies, like, people were really happy because they had finally, they weren't completely consumed with consuming, and they weren't completely consumed with producing, right? So they had found some other avenue to, you know, something else to do with their lives other than producing and consuming. And they tended to have longer lifespans, they were happier, they had, you know, lower suicide rates, you know, some interesting, you know, markers which gives us something that, you know, if we do focus on ourselves, not in the selfie mode of focus, right, but really about, you know, how am I behaving, how am I acting, right? How am I consuming? Am I just completely, you know, living to buy and consume things, right? Then this gives us an insight about how that, you know, might at least be, you know, achieved, you know. So maybe we'll stop with the part, because we're about to go where Allah talks about how He taught Adam, right, the names of all things, and how the angels, essentially, you know, the angels bowed to him, right? What was it about this highly flawed, chaotic, violent creation that despite that, despite the angels critiquing also then bowed to Adam. But in most cultures that bow, bowing is not an act of worship. It's an act of what? Respect. Right? You know, Muslims all freak out if you go to Japan and people bow to you. Oh my God, they're not making sajda. It's like, man. No, like, you know, in many cultures, bowing is a sign of respect, right? So despite, this is, I think, another important part for us too, is that despite um, having all these flaws, a person has a chance for redemption and respectability and dignity, right? That you can even be worthy of respect from the angels. And that is something that if we articulate that in the right way, I think can be very empowering. Mm-hmm. Because when people have had their dignity stripped from them, they will do some really, really horrible, heinous, chaotic, weird things. And restoring somebody's dignity can be one of the greatest acts you can help somebody with, right? And that for me, I've always seen Islam as a message that really wants to dignify, قَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, right? Allah says what, and we sort of ennobled or dignified, the children of Adam. So that comes though from having some sense of like hope and redemption. That despite your flaws, you still can overcome them and be something great, even worthy, again, of the respect of the angels. Any thoughts, questions?
Well, when you said about purifying the nafs,
Mm-hmm.
isn't the 5 pillars, isn't that what it's supposed to do? Like,
Well, yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, so it's really funny. For the last almost 30 years, right, I've been kind of a casual student of the so-called topic of Islamic spirituality. And a lot of it, to be quite honest, I find very convoluted and overly, it's just opaque. It's just, if you pray 5 times a day or strive to pray 5 times a day, that in itself will, Allah says, as-salah, what it is, tanha anil fahsha, right? It's something that will negate, evil. Not to say that if you pray 5 times a day, you will automatically be a great person, right? But there is something about the ritual for the average. I mean, there's always going to be some exception, like some tyrant or whatever, right? But for the average person, I think that if they make an earnest striving to pray 5 times a day, that it will have a positive impact on who they are if they're doing it consciously. Now, if you're just like robotically doing it, well, that's a different story, right? Or, the fasting or giving zakah or, all of those things, right? Or some other aspects of the Prophet's life, that like fasting. Fasting isn't only, like if you really, really love the Prophet or you claim to really want to follow the Sunnah, right? Then fasting was for the Prophet ﷺ a regular, lifelong habit and discipline, right? And I think, sometimes I wonder if really, to describe Islam as a religion is a little bit, it's like how do we translate this word deen or whatnot, right? For me, it certainly has those disciplinary aspects to it, right? And the Prophet ﷺ was a disciplined person, right? That he fasted routinely, he gave charity routinely. I mean, these kinds of things, if you do them, I believe will have that purifying aspect to it, but in a way that's not convoluted. Yeah. It doesn't really, that was like when I try to talk about today in the khutbah, right? It doesn't take a lot of knowledge. It takes no title. It takes no position. It takes having no authority to go and feed people or visit the sick or visit the elderly. You don't have to have ijaza. You don't have to be a hadith scholar. You don't have to have any of this stuff, which really comes down to like, well, what is, not to repeat my khutbah, but like, what does your heart beat for? Does your heart beat at the, like, what does it speed up and slow down for, right? I think that's a, if it doesn't at some point either speed up or slow down for some of those, things from the deen, then at least that's a point where you can look to yourself and, really ask yourself, what am I doing in my life? And not always leaving it up to somebody else. I think that's where it's like, I wonder why so many Muslims seem almost like flabbergasted or frustrated, like what to do with themselves. It's like, do you really need a title? I mean, I'll give you one. If you just, that's all it is. I'll just hand out titles. But yeah, I don't think it has to be very complicated or convoluted. The basics, I'm not trying to make tonight like, Kung Fu theater or something, but like, Confucius theater. But, most martial arts, no matter how high you may, go into it, or even like boxing, which I also kind of consider like a martial art. I don't care how great of a boxer you get, you never escape the need to what? Do footwork, do push-ups, run, your speed bag, heavy bag, right? All martial arts have some aspect of them that is like really, really like mundane, like, I don't know, doing the horse stance or whatever that it is, right? Or if you're judo, just like rolling. Like you'll never, I don't care what belt you get, right? You don't move beyond that. And in the same way with Islam, there is no higher plane of enlightenment to go to without these fundamentals, right? Praying, fasting, charity, preserving the private parts, the tongue, right? They may not be flashy, and that's where a lot of people maybe are looking for, but flashy doesn't tend to transform people either.
Even just that, it's not easy.
Right, which is probably why most people look, they look, that's why I think yoga, I know I harp on yoga a lot. I think that's the attraction to things like yoga, because, I mean, certainly there's some aspects of yoga that are technically difficult, right? I mean, people doing like some of the stuff that's like a human pretzel. Okay, technically that's difficult. But imagine if yoga only worked if you could only do it at like Fajr. There wouldn't be like a multi-billion-dollar industry of like yoga pants, and nobody would be wearing yoga pants if they had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do yoga. The fact that you can do it whenever you want and it fits into your lifestyle and there's no judgment that's a part of it. I mean, I think that's why those, and then they appear to be very spiritual, right? And I mean, undoubtedly, there's probably is some benefit of like the connection between the mind and the body and doing those things. I mean, I'm not discounting it, entirely, but it does fit into where I think our society is at, right? It is a little bit flashy, right? Because number one, you go on, Instagram or whatever, you don't really tend to see videos of people doing yoga that are like in their 70s or 80s, right? It's like young people who are like hot and sexy doing yoga. It's like it has some other qualities, to it as well, and that sells, obviously. It's a, it's a very youth, it's just kind of it just reinforces some of the pathologies we already have, right, as a society, as a culture. There probably isn't a lot that's very sexy about getting up early in the morning and praying, right?
It's funny that you say that because I've been doing yoga for like more
Oh man.
And the tradition of yoga actually is you have to do it at least 3 times a day, like 10 minutes. And the first time that you do it is before sunrise. So there's actually like, the more I learn about it, there's actually a lot of commonalities with Sola.
I mean, I'm sure.
Sola,
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised, and it's like original,
Right,
right?
right.
But in its commercialized
Oh yeah,
version,
yeah.
right? It
And
it
like now people just want to like exert themselves when they do yoga when actually you're not supposed to. Like they want to go in and like I want to learn how to do handstands and headstands and that's not the point. So like my instructor, she's like sometimes she gets frustrated because like no, this is not the spirit of yoga.
right, and that's and therefore going back to the very beginning part, right? These expectations of what is a thing, right? So the expectation is it's going to be like anything else that's flashy or fancy, and if it doesn't meet that expectation, well, that must not be it. And in the same way, right? This cannot be the word of God because it's talking about insects. This is not befitting of God. Do you know God or does God know you? Right? So this, these expectations that we project forward, and a lot of this comes from culture. I mean, this is the power of culture, um, and that it tends to uncritically inform a lot of our assumptions about reality, right? So yeah, I'm sure probably in the same way that your yoga teacher is pulling his or her hair out because people are expecting it to, uh, it's just like people that come to. I remember, people would come to dojo because they saw, I don't know, The Matrix or whatever. That's not,
Yeah.
you know, that's not, that's not a martial art, and that's also not going to save you in the street. Like whether you're learning to actually physically defend yourself or do a martial art, because those can be two very different things. Neither one of those are, if your expectation of what is going to be real is The Matrix, then right, you're going to be sorely disappointed. Um,
But I think that I'm not sleeping. I think that whether it's yoga, martial arts, Islam, right? Um, Oftentimes, your initial approach is one that has some unrealistic expectations, right? But part of correcting the expectations or having those expectations realigned to reality comes through the practice, right? So like you mentioned the 5 pillars, like it's practice, 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 practice. All of those things are things that need to like literally be exercised, be practiced. Yoga, probably when you first came into yoga, your perspective isn't what it is now. Coming into martial arts, yeah, everybody wanted to be Bruce Leroy, right?
mm-hmm,
But then
mm-hmm.
once they committed themselves, and I think that's the most important thing, right? A person willing to commit themselves to what it is that they say that they want to become, or what it is that they want, that they say that they want to partake of, want to partake in, right?
Yes.
And as long as that, I believe that as long as that commitment is there, and there's this continuity and this consistency in the practice, then inshallah the expectation and the perspective, it starts to align with reality, right? But it comes with the practice.
Yeah.
For some of us, waking up at 6, 5, 4 o'clock in the morning is difficult until we do it repeatedly, and then next thing you know, you're actually looking forward to waking up at 6, 5, 4 o'clock in the morning, right? But that's like over time, I think.
Yeah. And it takes time to re-habituate yourself, right? That I think in terms of purification and whatnot is, it isn't like pouring bleach on something, right? That's sterilization.
It's a process.
That's a very different sterilization and purification, right? Are two very different things. You can sterilize something in a second, right? Um, but it is also tends to be, if you look from a certain point of view, it's a destructive process, right? It's like when you take an antibiotic, right? It completely destroys. That's why a lot of people, they get sick. I'm not advising anybody not to take an antibiotic, right? But I'm just saying that a lot of people will get sick, be given an antibiotic, and then they'll get sick from the antibiotic because the antibiotic, I mean, it is what? Antibacteria is another way to say it, right? So all of the good bacteria, because we're mostly, I think they say for every human cell, we're like a microbe, it's like a 1 to 10 ratio. So we're actually more microbes than human cells, which is another question of what is a human being? But if your digestion, it isn't only a process of stomach acid just dissolving things, right? They break down, and then all this bacteria, different parts in your digestive tract, take over and process. Well, if you drop a neutron bomb in there for bacteria, then good and bad is gone. So people often so sterilization is very different than purification. So purification will undoubtedly involve, it's more of a process, right? It's not a instantaneous kind of thing.
I know for myself, I thought about it when I first, being a revert, when I got to that point, all I had was these set of experiences that I had to draw on. When I made a decision, I drew on these experiences. So as on this side, I started gaining new experiences to wipe those out.
Right, right.
So I got a new one here, that one went away. And that's how I kind of look at it, like, as far as the purification. The more I practice, the more I learn, the more of those things fall
Exactly,
off.
yeah.
And it's not, I'm not trying to get on into the clouds.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
It's a practical process. It's not, it's nothing where you're just going to sit there and some of the people think you get filled with the spirit.
Right.
Just
Yeah.
sitting there.
It's work.
Yeah, it's work.
Yeah. It'll inevitably be more mundane than what we expect. I mean, I think that's the beautiful part about that passage in the Qur'an, right, where Allah talks about, he's not too shy to, use an insect. Inna Allah la yastahi an yadriba mathalan ma ba'datan, that he's not too shy to use an insect, so to speak, a little gnat, to make a point or make a parable or an analogy. Is that, what is a gnat? It's just, they're everywhere, they're nothing. It's very mundane, right? They were expecting, Michael Bay, CGI, thunderclap. You know what I mean? They were expecting that when it was far more subtle, right? So again, those misplaced expectations that we then put on, so-called spirituality or purification, right? That it, I think I was reading about the basketball player John Sally had some quote like, nothing changes anything except for change, and change changes everything, right? So you have to, it's something you're going to have to do. It's not a abstract mental concept, right? It's going to inevitably involve some elbow grease, right? And like you said, that's an experience too. And I think the important thing and I think maybe that's what a lot of people are missing today, even in their so-called spiritual pursuits, is that they're not getting experience. And experience is very different than, passively looking at images or, it's something that you live and do, right? And it tends to be transformative, right? Experiences do transform you too. They make new memories, as you said. While they don't necessarily get rid of old, but they do form new memories, and I think that's one of the good things about experience, and that as we've gotten less hands-on with everything today, I think maybe that is a lot of what is making things more difficult than what they really need to be, because we're just missing that. There's There's a tactile quality of getting out of bed at 5 o'clock in the morning and splashing water on your face, right?
Serious.
Right? I mean, you have to live that.
Yeah.
You can't think it. You can't talk about it. You can't philosophize about it. You can't tweet it. You can't whatever Snapchat it. You actually have to do it, and you can't do anything else while doing it, right? So it can't be multitasked. It can't be simulcast. It can't be whatever, right? It's something that you have to do in that moment. And I think that, if we can return maybe to that spirit, then maybe we'll actually feel a bit more spiritual and, purified. But, So we'll pick up on the part next week, inshallah, where Allah talks about teaching Adam the names of all things, inshallah.
All right. Did you get everything written down?
Copy my notes.
Somebody's taking notes.
I just take pictures of it.